What an interesting time to be preaching on feminisms, right? What's been going on lately? We have Sandra Fluke, a law student trying to persuade Congress that contraceptives should be considered medically necessary enough for insurance coverage. This is in a time when 90% of the best-selling health plans charge women more than men, and yet many of them refuse to cover reproductive health, even including maternity care, without a special rider. Reproductive health is a major focus and a major expense for about a third of women's lives, so leaving it out is a huge omission. Congress held a hearing on the issue, but at first they did so with an all-male panel. Thankfully, that raised a ruckus. So Sandra Fluke was finally heard. But then, of course, shock jock Rush Limbaugh called her a slut. Whoa there. He's lucky he hasn't been chased out of the country with pitchforks. I wish he had. Conservative legislators are dancing like they're on hot coals to avoid the impression that they think birth control is immoral, and liberal legislators are filing bills to make a point. Have you heard about these? One of them would make men who want a prescription for Viagra have to get a witness statement from their romantic partner confirming the need. And a cardiac test to make sure that they're up for it. Another bill is so explicit that I can't figure out how to describe it without embarrassing all of us. You know something serious is happening when the national conversation is too racy for the UU church. Of course, no one expects these laws to pass. They're just meant to point out how routine it has become for lawmakers to regulate women's reproductive health, and in contrast, how preposterous it seems to regulate men's. So there's a lot going on, and these are feminist issues in the sense that they have to do with fairness to women and women having their voices heard, but not all women who care about fairness and about having a voice would consider themselves feminist these days. And women who do call themselves feminist often disagree about what that means. Sometimes the disagreement is generational. Sometimes it has to do with class and race. Nowadays, we may speak of first, second, and third wave feminisms. Womanism, where women's issues explicitly engage with race, and las mujeristas, Latina feminism. There are women who are trailblazers and role models who don't think of themselves in terms of liberated or not. And there are, especially in my generation and younger, women who think of themselves as liberated and who revel in their freedom, but who make choices and behave in ways that give older women heartburn. Girls gone wild. What do suffrage, breaking the glass ceiling, and reality TV have in common? Women pushing boundaries. In suffrage and breaking the glass ceiling, which, by the way, is not completely broken, we were establishing women's rights to have a voice and to choose their own destiny. For younger generations, some of those reality TV shows represent the sexual liberation that was won alongside these. What does equality look like? What do young women owe the generations who broke down barriers before us? And why is this important to talk about in church? First, a quick history. First wave feminists are the ones we think of as the suffragists. They won the right to vote in 1920. That's their most famous accomplishment. But they also engaged other reforms. They tackled public health and hygiene, education, morality, abolition, and birth control. They didn't think of what they were doing as feminism. It was called the woman movement, meant to convince society that women are not property, but full human beings. Unfortunately, it didn't take all women into account equally. African Americans and other women of color were usually excluded from meetings, and the movement took on the tone and the perspective of the privileged class. Once the right to vote had been secured, younger women distanced themselves from that movement. Anti-feminist propaganda characterized the woman movement as full of lonely spinsters out to needlessly antagonize men. Some members of the National Woman Suffrage Association were outspoken advocates not only of voting, but also of Marxism and free love. That's right, baby boomers. Before your generation let loose in the 60s, some of your grandparents were talking about free love. On the surface, it seemed that those wild ideas contributed to feminism's reputation as anti-American and anti-family. But in reality, as we've seen recently, people who are threatened by the empowerment of women have always found a way to characterize it as anti-American and anti-family. Opponents of legalizing birth control in the 1920s argued that it would lead to promiscuity. That's the same argument we hear today about providing it to teens or making it affordable and accessible. The more things change, the more they stay the same. As first-wave feminism died down, and then as men returned from World War II and took factory jobs back from the women who had kept the country going in their absence, women's attention was directed back to the home. A huge amount of marketing and propaganda portrayed women as household managers who combined science and technology with domesticity and aesthetics to create efficient, peaceful homes. Think Leave It to Beaver. That was the trend for a while. And then women got bored. Stifled, actually. In 1963, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which named the deep emptiness many women were feeling. It was a bestseller. What many women thought had been their personal shortcoming turned out to be a huge social problem. Friedan founded the National Organization for Women, and a second wave of feminism began. Now, there was a lot of other activism going on, too. The civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement. A huge cultural shift was underway. Many of the outspoken, determined women who were active in these began to notice a hypocrisy in them. Although they were based on ideas of equality and justice, women were still often relegated to traditional roles as cooks, secretaries, and sexual partners. So they organized. While first-wave feminists had overcome legal obstacles to equality, the second wave expanded into other areas, changing divorce and custody laws, creating laws against marital rape, integrating women into sports and the workplace. Abortion was made legal. They built rape crisis centers and women's shelters, and, legend has it, they burned some bras. I don't know if it really happened, but the image has become emblematic of women bursting out of social confines. This is the heyday of Gloria Steinem and the feminist theologian Mary Daly, Ms. Magazine, and women beginning to change the field of ministry and other fields by challenging old boys' networks and bringing perspectives that had long been missing. Many of you were part of it. It wasn't easy, but I might not be up here today if you hadn't done it. Christine was one of the trailblazers in our field, and the formation of a high-quality child care center was one of this congregation's contributions to the betterment of women's lives. That child care center, back in the 70s, became La Puerta, which still rents our now crowded Sunday school space. And that was its social justice mission, high-quality child care so women could work in a time when such a thing was hard to find. They did this amidst all the same old arguments about feminism being anti-family and immoral, and you can imagine that when issues of sex and pornography became divisive among feminists, the controversy was quite serious. Anti-pornography feminists argued that porn perpetuated male dominance and exploited women. Others, who called themselves sex-positive, argued that it would be controlling, maybe even paternalistic and old-fashioned, to tell women what they could and couldn't do with their sexual selves. Women should be free to express their sexuality however they wanted, they said. Related to this, serious questions arose about what it means to be a feminist. A few weeks ago, I met with a few women from this congregation who I admire and who I suspected would call themselves feminists. One of the themes that came up again and again in our conversation was the feeling that there's a certain expectation of how a feminist will behave. And it isn't coming from men or from the media. It's a legacy of the second wave, of this question about whether certain behaviors are bad for women. Can we wear high heels and makeup? Can we choose to have children and be stay-at-home moms? Have we failed if our daughters become obsessed with Barbies and princesses, like mine did? Even today, my daughter has a penchant for singing Disney princess songs in perfect pitch and with plenty of vibrato as she does her chores. Although now that she's 16, she does it with a hefty dose of irony. It's really quite funny. Women in my generation resent being told what they can and cannot do by feminism or by patriarchy. We're concerned about which voices have been marginalized in the conversation: women of color, transgendered people, women with disabilities, women in other cultures who may have different dreams than American women. This is the context of third wave feminism. It's only possible for third wave feminists to have the concerns they do because of the successes and mistakes made by those earlier movements. The sense of urgency is lower these days, and this makes way for a greater tolerance of diverse perspectives and slow, complex conversations. And that's good. But there's still work to do. I've been speaking in generalizations, but the boundaries between generations and classes and ethnicities are permeable. And feminist concerns are not limited to women. Actually, it was the work of two journalists, one male, one female, married to each other, that inspired me to write this sermon. In an issue of the New York Times Magazine that was devoted to the condition of women in the world, Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wu-Dunn wrote, "If you are reading this, the phrase gender discrimination might conjure thoughts of unequal pay, underfinanced sports teams, or unwanted touching from a boss." They understand, but when they lived in Beijing in the late 80s and early 90s, they observed a paradox that they would never forget. In 1989, they were journalists at Tiananmen Square, watching troops fire their automatic weapons at pro-democracy protesters. Images of the massacre, which claimed hundreds of lives, transfixed the world and appeared constantly on television screens. But the following year, they say, they came across a demographic study that outlined a human rights violation that had claimed tens of thousands more lives. This study found that 39,000 baby girls died annually in China because parents didn't give them the same medical care and attention that boys received, and that was just in the first year of life. As many infant girls died unnecessarily every week in China as protesters died at Tiananmen Square. Those girls never received an inch of news coverage. Kristof and Wu-Dunn began to worry about journalistic priorities. In 2009, they published a book called Half the Sky that paints more of the picture of women in the world today. Women have longer life expectancies than men, with the result that in much of the world there are slightly more females than males in the population. Women make up 50.8% of population in the US. However, where women are severely oppressed, they vanish. In China, there are 107 males for every 100 females. In India, there are 108 males for every 100 females. Using figures like these from other countries as well, economists figure that there are as many as 107 million females missing from the globe today. What's happening? Well, disparities in healthcare are a major factor. In India, girls under 5 are 50% more likely to die than boys. Worldwide, a woman dies in childbirth approximately every 60 seconds. Most of that is preventable. Selective abortion is another. In countries where boys are preferred and girls who are not allowed to work are economic burdens, ultrasound technology has led to many abortions of female fetuses. There's infanticide, too. And older girls and women are not safe either. There are 5,000 honor killings per year. In India, there are bride burnings, 1 every 2 hours on average. Girls who try to attend school in Afghanistan might have acid thrown in their faces on their way, or their schools may be gassed or bombed. That can be deadly. And then there are the dangers of just being brutally, brutally oppressed. Many girls are sold into sexual slavery or forced prostitution. It's common in India and Thailand, although the US is not exempt. A common trap involves offering a poor girl of about 12 or 13 a job as a maid far away from home, sometimes in another country. Believing she'll be able to help her family or just finally afford to eat, she agrees, and then the employer locks her in a brothel or sells her to someone else who will. There, she will be beaten for resisting and drugged to make her look happy. Girls are kept without clothing to make it less likely they'll escape. The brutality is shocking. Of people living in poverty around the world, 70% are women and children, and only 1% of the world's landowners are women. 1%. There is a lot of work to do. The situation is bad for women, and it's bad for the sons and daughters who are born to them in brokenness and despair, and it's very bad for the soul of the world. However, and this is a big however, there are some simple solutions that would make a big difference. Women and girls are not the problem, say Christoph and Wu Dun, but the solution. Studies show that when women are empowered, it not only protects them, it's also good for the whole community. Women who have been kept from paid work are the greatest economic resource for impoverished countries, not oil. Women. They share the story of Saima in Pakistan. Saima was married to a deadbeat husband who didn't work and who beat her up a lot. She cried all the time. She had to send her oldest daughter to live with an aunt because she couldn't afford to feed her. To make matters worse, her husband had racked up $3,000 in debt, more than Saima could ever imagine them being able to pay off. When she gave birth to a second daughter, her husband, who wanted a son, threatened to take another wife, and Saima was devastated. She and her children would have even less to eat, and she would never be equal to the other woman. Desperate, Saima decided to try a last-ditch effort by applying for a microloan in spite of their other debt. With $65, she bought beads and cloth, which she turned into beautiful embroidery that she was able to sell to merchants. With the profit, she bought more beads and cloth. Soon she had paid off her debt and was the owner of a business that brought in a reliable income. She got her older daughter back and paid off her husband's debt. Eventually, she hired 30 other families to work for her, and her husband, now dependent, did not dare hit her anymore. In fact, he's so impressed with women now that when Saima gave birth to a third girl, he said, "Girls are just as good as boys." There are many, many stories like this, where women use their power not only to help their families, but to build up the economies in their communities. Studies have shown that when women in the developing world control their family's income, they're more likely to invest in education, nutrition, housing, and health care. When men control it, spending on alcohol and prostitutes goes up. This is not a generalization about men everywhere, but information about habits in some developing countries where women are severely oppressed. It turns out that targeting aid to women in developing countries may be the most effective way to reduce suffering and poverty. And when economies improve, that reduces extremism and is good for everyone's national security. But only a very small percentage of US foreign aid is currently targeted to women and girls. In the online version of this sermon, I'm going to link to some articles and to the book I mentioned so that you can check them out. But you can also help by stopping by that UUSC table in the courtyard to make a donation. The UUSC does very effective work with women and girls. And you can find out more about microfinance at a forum on April 22nd in the social hall. A new justice group dedicated to microfinance has just formed here at First Unitarian. If you're in one of our branches and you're interested in microfinance, send an email to the church office and we'll link you in. I'm going to invite the band to come back up. In a moment, the band is going to play one of my favorite songs, Just a Girl by Gwen Stefani. This is a song with a little righteous anger to it. It's upbeat and serious. Maybe you've felt a little righteous anger this morning, a little fire, a little passion. I'm remembering our reading that Jessica shared, women walking in loud shoes. That's a punishable offense in Afghanistan, Victoria Safford said. And as she clomped down the corridor, she thought of women everywhere. I want to invite you to make some noise with your feet. Abraham, would you give us a beat? Let's start with the women and the girls. Let's hear your shoes. Make a little noise for your sisters in this room and in this country and all around the world. If you're watching from the branches, I want you to make some noise too. Join in. And let's hear the men and the boys making some noise for your sisters in the room. And in this country and all around the world, this beat, this noise is for women, it's for the empowered ones and the disempowered ones and the missing ones, for their daughters and for their sons and for everyone, because we depend on each other. And it's for sons like Trayvon Martin, who are also taught to be quiet and invisible, because to be too present would be considered a threat. It's a prayer and a song of rebellion and solidarity and love, which sometimes makes us get a little mad.